Welcome, dear people, to this festive episode of Reportercast for December 2022. My name is Matei Rosca, the journalist behind Reporter.London, the website, and what better way to celebrate the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ than by discussing all the ways his subjects are lying, cheating, and stealing from each other, bullying journalists and manipulating civil society, dodging taxes, and trying to bend the rules for selfish gain every waking moment of every day. Indeed, with today's guest, we will be taking on an extremely politically sensitive story, one that has divided opinion across the United States and the world. It has pitted journalists against each other, and moreover, it has tangled up Twitter, one of the world's biggest social media platforms, in a censorship scandal as recently as this week under the banner of the Twitter files. But this censorship scandal has been going on over a year. Now, the subject at hand is Hunter Biden's laptop, Hunter Biden being one of the sons of United States President Joe Biden. And apparently it's not just one laptop, but apparently it's three. And they include alleged proof of very serious financial malfeasance among other alleged crimes. And our guest today is the man who sits right in the middle of the story, the researcher who surfaced all of the allegations, who went through the data in the laptop and published it in various media outlets. Garrett Ziegler, who is a former Trump White House staffer who used to write reports for Donald Trump. Thanks for joining us, Garrett.
Thank you very much, Matei. I appreciate you having me on.
Before the questions, I'd like to say thank you to our sponsor, H5 Strategies, a consulting firm in Bucharest, specialized in political and executive advisory across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. And now for the first question. Before we get into the actual laptop, can we address some of the controversies around this story, starting with, are you affiliated with Donald Trump today? And if you are, or even if you're not, don't you think he's a much bigger crook than Hunter Biden can ever dream of becoming?
Well, to answer your first question, no, I'm not. I'm not employed or paid by any political action committee affiliated with the former president. In fact, I haven't spoken to him directly since January 18th, 2021, nearly 2 years ago. And so this is a completely separate nonprofit we established in July of 2021. All of our financials are, they're available for anybody with an internet connection and a cursory knowledge of how to navigate the IRS website. And to answer your second question, think about it this way. I had access to Hunter Biden's laptop for, not even 2 years now. And he himself only used that particular device for less than 6 months. And at the very least, we found evidence of over a dozen different federal felonies. And the number 459 is the number that we found was basically the floor of every time one of those 20 felonies was committed. And so you'd think that because they have used the FISA surveillance court and other avenues to get at Trump's financial affairs and his broader life, I mean, the U.S. House of Representatives just released a press release yesterday saying that they looked at all of his tax returns. You'd think that if they had that sort of analysis, not just one device, but his entire sort of desk, that they would find something, but they haven't. And over the course of 6 years, Matei, there's been controversy after controversy, starting with Stormy Daniels, an embarrassing scenario for the former president, and that ended up with Michael Avenatti going to the pen for years. And so our allegations are conservative. We try to strike a floor, meaning we didn't include anything in this dossier, Matei, that there wasn't two pieces of corroborating evidence for. So if we found, for example, one wire transfer, that wasn't enough to include in here. We had to find a text message or another email that alludes to that wire transfer, because we wanted to be able to stand up to scrutiny. If there's just one piece of evidence for something, even if it's a blatant email, that can be claimed in another way. The Bidens could claim plausible deniability for that. And so I think that if anybody takes the time to read through the dossier, read through the 2,000 footnotes, they will come away with the idea that this was done very methodically, and we don't accuse Hunter of anything that we think he didn't do. It's very thorough, and that's why I'm glad that you invited me on today so we could talk about it and reach a different audience.
No, that's fine. I understand, and I do agree with you. I have read most of it, and I agree it is thorough. It's not for me to decide whether all of it is accurate or not, but given how many publications actually picked up these allegations, I suppose with all these big newsrooms publishing them, they probably have faith that the allegations are solid, even if they end up not being picked up in court. So before just another question before we get into the data. You made a promotional clip for this dossier,
Yes.
saying that people should support the non-profit Marco Polo because the election in 2020 was a sham. And I wonder if you just said that because you wanted to appeal to a conservative audience and you wanted to to speak metaphorically, or do you actually think the election was illegitimate? Because if you don't think Joe Biden won the election, then, I at the very least, I can understand why big outlets such as, I don't know, CNN and whatever didn't really want to touch this story.
Well, I think that, first of all, the concerns about the 2020 election have nothing to do with the fact that Joe Biden is the president today, meaning I believe he is the United States president, but I just think that like many elections before the 2020 election, it was fraudulently conducted. And my argument is very simple. In the U.S. Constitution, it prescribes that the time, manner, and place of elections is to be decided by the state legislatures. That didn't occur in 2020. And one of the reasons for that, Matei, is because they said that the pandemic required them to send out mail-in ballots to everybody on the list, no matter if they requested one. In that way, because it circumvented state legislatures and it was decided by the executive, i.e. state, the Secretary of State or the governor, that is why I think it's illegitimate. Now, somebody who has a nuanced mind can hold two different ideas at the same time. They can still think that there were problems with the legality of the 2020 election and see the exhibits in our report. Even if you don't agree with me about the election fraud, you would agree that the data in here is in dispute. And in fact, all of the left-wing outlets and all of the mainstream outlets that have given limited hangouts about the Biden laptop have not disputed the content. They have not found one byte of manufactured data. And they've tried. They've gone through the 128,000 emails that my nonprofit put up in May at BidenLaptopEmails.com. And not one email was doctored because we didn't change anything. We simply took it from the laptop onto the website. And so my answer is very simple. I do believe that the election was fraudulently conducted in 2020, but that has no basis in the arguments of money laundering, FARA violations, etc.
Right.
And I think
sorry. Can I just ask you a yes or no simple question? Do you think Joe Biden won the election squarely, fairly?
No.
Good Lord. Well, I mean, that's just madness, isn't it? But anyway, it's.
Well, I would say that if you don't agree with that, you have to read more U.S. history. In 1960, the same thing occurred, except the rectification methods weren't used by Nixon. He didn't really fight it. And even liberal biographers have come to that conclusion that basically the political machine in Chicago with the Dailies and the other people in Texas stole the election for Kennedy. And LBJ's election in 1948 in Texas in the Senate race was stolen as well. And so I think my claim that elections can have fraud and that there are laws being broken is in no way abnormal. In fact, there were more than a half a dozen Democrats who objected to the 2016 election of Donald Trump, and yet no one asked them anything. So I think that my my problems with it are within the course of American history, not that abnormal. And again, I think that the 2020 election is a subsection of this dossier, which there is a 2020 election subsection. And what I mentioned in that, Matei, is basically that there was a bipartisan conspiracy, not a theory, but a conspiracy to go against Donald Trump, wherein you have the chairman of the largest corporation on planet Earth, Greg Penner of Walmart, who was Hunter Biden's college classmate at Georgetown, having a call with Hunter in October of 2018, asking Hunter to get his dad and John Kasich, a Republican, to run on a joint ticket. So that's what I mean by conspiracy. There was a uniparty conspiracy to try to get Donald Trump out.
Politicians do that all the time. Politicians and business people lobby each other and sort of partner with each other all the time. You make it sound, when you say conspiracy, you make it sound like there's this sort of almost occult thing happening to keep Donald Trump out of power. But Donald Trump is, frankly, he's not that good a politician, and he's got too much baggage, so
but the word conspiracy doesn't necessarily connote criminality. I mean, if we look it up in Webster's, I'm simply saying that there was a group of people, and I agree with you that politicians do this all the time. Why this is news to me, Matei, is that we have all of this primary source material. That's really one of the biggest stories and even a liberal magazine called New York Magazine, Andrew Rice is a writer there, and he in September came out with a 5,000-word piece about how this is the most primary source material that has ever surfaced on a member of a U.S. first family, meaning we have over 200 gigabytes. So I think that's what's unique about it, that we have the phone call itself with the guy. It's not that it's what they're doing is never been done before.
Right. Okay. And can you say a few words about Marco Polo, the nonprofit? Actually, how did you end up working for the White House in the first place? What were you doing before the White House? And after that, a little bit about Marco Polo, please.
Yeah, so I got an internship at the White House when I was a senior in college in the fall of 2017. And through that, I got to know a man named Peter Navarro. And, I consider myself a heretic in many ways. I don't believe what a lot of people believe. And because I'm a Lutheran, I'm a double heretic. I'm a Lutheran who doesn't believe in free trade. And not because I don't think there'll be free trade in heaven, but I just think that the sinful nature of man, like you alluded to at the introduction of the show, prohibits there to be free and fair commerce between nations. And so when I got to know Peter Navarro, I realized that he was a heretic like me, and heretics tend to stick together. And so I ended up working for him after I graduated college for 2 years, from 2019 to 2021. And it was a dream. Peter was a college professor for 30 years, and so he had a very young staff. Everybody was under 30, and we got to work on projects from domestic manufacturing to the election fraud. Now, the election fraud was a little bit of a different project than the other things that we did, but still, I think that Peter was always around late 20s research, graduate assistants in his college years, and so that environment translated into the White House, and it was a lot different than all the other offices. And through that, leading to your next question, I fell in love with open source intelligence tools. Half of my day was spent on Commerce Department websites, getting raw trade data from all the countries of the world. And through that, that's sort of the thrill of the hunt, is a very safe, wholesome way to get a dopamine fix as opposed to other stimulants. And that has really drove me. And what I mean by that is every single day, all I'm doing is scouring. Like for this report, I worked with 2 private investigators. We took a lot of the people in Hunter's contacts in his phone, which was hooked up via iCloud to his laptop, and ran background reports on them. And so what I would do is look at those background reports, look at the LLCs that they're the ultimate beneficial owners of, go pull their documentation from the Secretaries of State website, and then map out their assets. And that's essentially what I did for the report, is look at public records, look at the data on the laptop, and try to find any violation of laws. Because the report, again, and you probably know this, Matei, but maybe some of your listeners don't, the report is not about Hunter's degeneracy sexually. The only time we mention that is when there's a violation of law. We don't make fun of him for the purpose of making fun of him. We did confirm that there were 3 violations of human trafficking laws without dispute. Some people are saying that Hunter raped 10-year-old girls. That's just hoaxes that were started by some in the right-wing media in the United States. We've stayed away from that, and we've actually identified the people who came up with those hoaxes. So I would, say that an open source intelligence group is what Marco Polo is. There's 6 of us in the group, and we get leads all the time. I would say 30% of them pan out. 70% of them don't cut it, but it's a dream. I love what I do.
Right, and now that this story is kind of winding down, what are you going to do next? What are you planning? Are you going to get into Republican politics? Are you going to be an opposition researcher for one of these candidates, or what?
No, we've stayed away. That's why we went with the 501c3 as opposed to the 501c4. I find a lot of the candidates and elected officials in the United States very underwhelming. Personally, like people I wouldn't want to spend time with. They're just not interesting. They don't have a grasp of history. So what we're interested in especially is the cartels. We think the drug cartels have an outsized influence in American politics, particularly the southwestern states. And we're going to be starting a pretty big project. It won't result in a 640-page report. It'll probably be 1/6 of that. But we're starting a big project on a cargo air shipment facility at an airport in Arizona called Skybridge, and it's going to be the first of its kind in the United States, whereby Mexican customs officials are going to be stationed inside the United States, and they've built this as a way to speed up commerce. But what really is going to happen is there's going to be zero way to effectively police all kinds of contraband and other illicit materials going to be shipped in the United States. We're very interested in that. And again, if somebody reads these 644 pages, because you made a comment about Republican, I'm not a Republican, but and if somebody reads this report, they'll see that we actually criticize Republicans more than Democrats. In fact, that infamous letter on October 19th, 2020, from former intelligence officials, there were more Republicans who signed that letter than Democrats. So I think that this laptop story, and you mentioned the Twitter files at the top, those Twitter files reveal that there were a lot of Republicans involved in this as well. And so we really think it's an indictment on the entire political class. I don't want to say entire, probably 95% of the I try to stay away from absolutes, but right. There was a bipartisan effort to stop this material from coming to the public.
Right. Yeah, I suppose there was, and I suppose just the other day it was pretty clear from the Twitter files reporting that the FBI was pressuring Twitter quite hard to stop the story, claiming it was a Russian hack and leak operation. And it does turn out, with hindsight at least, that it wasn't. But do you have anything to add to that?
I would just say,
how did you feel when you realized that? How did you feel when you realized that authorities of the government were trying to stop the story?
Well, the feeling is, first of all, anger, and second of all, my nerdiness takes over. And I will just say that 2 of the officials implicated in this scheme, and it is a scheme, we can't find statute violations right away, other than the First Amendment, which isn't a statute, right? But it's ingrained in our Constitution. 2 of the officials, Elvis Chan and Laura Dimlow, were already featured in our dossier. And the reason why we knew that is because I've been close with the plaintiffs in a case called Missouri v. Biden, who in those state attorneys general are suing the federal government for working with social media platforms to censor what they deem to be misinformation. And so those 2 officials were named in this Twitter drop. But to me, it's all about, the core is the FBI wants to claim plausible deniability by saying that they didn't demand that they do this. They just suggest, sort of like it's an elbow to the ribs about, hey, this is what we deem, misinformation. If you want to stay in the good graces of the FBI, this is what the undertone is. They don't say this explicitly in the email. But if they only suggest it, then the FBI has plausible deniability to say, hey, look, this isn't a violation of the First Amendment. We didn't tell them to do this. They were acting on their own accord. But I would argue that that Twitter wouldn't have done that if but for the emails from the FBI. And so what I'm interested in more than anything is state level actions, because Joe, again, this isn't my opinion. This is what Joe said. He's very proud of his son. His son is the smartest man he knows, and he didn't do anything wrong. That's what he said. So if it's proven that Hunter did commit a federal felony and proven in court, not just in a report, he will be pardoned, and his sentence will be commuted, just like most presidents would do for their child. But the president can't pardon state level crimes, and there's a lot of things on this laptop, and we go into them. We actually, I went through the trouble of finding each state statute that he violated. And I worked with an attorney. In fact, attorney's fees were a fifth of our cost to try to find out which statute he violated in each state. So I would, if justice is to occur in this scenario, I think Hunter must be indicted at a state level. And again, it doesn't have to be for the drugs and sex, although that's appalling, Matei. It can be for money laundering. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the FARA violations too, because that's critical, because our laws are unique in that regard.
No, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that. I suppose... Yeah, well, I suppose Donald Trump pardoned what's his name, the lobbyist guy. He pardoned Roger Stone, didn't he? So
yeah,
America
but even worse than that, the one that I was most angered by, I think he should have pardoned Julian Assange and Ross Ulbricht and Edward Snowden. But the other one was Jared Kushner's father, and I don't like Jared Kushner. Most of the time spent in the White House with my office was fighting Jared Kushner's, because he is with the banking cartel. And if there's one thing that your listeners have to understand about me, it's that I hate the regime, capital T, capital R, and I consider the banking cartel to be probably the head of the regime. And this is, to me, it's global. So Kushner to me represents
let's cool it a little bit on that, because we don't want to sound like Alex Jones here, right? So we're just this stuff, when you talk about big global stuff, there's this febrile atmosphere, and I kind of feel for Twitter employees as well, because when there was this sort of moral panic around Russian influence at the time in 2020, everybody was talking about it. The Russians are out to get us, and Paul Manafort was working with a bunch of Russians and a bunch of corrupt oligarchs to influence the election, and so there was form in America for this sort of election interference. And you work at Twitter, you're kind of a techie geek, and you've got all these FBI people and official people coming over and saying, look, the fate of democracy is in your hands. So this probably made an impression. So I'm kind of I do blame the officials who put pressure on Twitter, because they should have known better, but I don't really blame Twitter employees, because I think when you come under that sort of pressure, it's very easy to be in awe of state power and think, oh man, I want to be on the good side of history here. So anyway, can I just go into the information in the file, in the Hunter Biden file? What mostly drew my attention, apart from all the fuss happening in America, was that it seemed that Hunter Biden was really active in Eastern Europe, which is my neck of the woods. And you've got Ukraine, you've got Romania, Serbia, and all of these countries, while his dad, Joe Biden, was the vice president. And so it seemed like, taken together, Hunter was trading very heavily on his dad's position. And even if Joe Biden didn't really act wrongly, it still looks like Hunter Biden was trying to give the impression that he could influence American policy. So could we talk a little bit about that, and firstly with Ukraine and Romania and what happened there?
Well, firstly, in both Ukraine and Romania, Hunter's violations of law were in one way, very simple. And you mentioned Paul Manafort. Hunter committed the same felonies that Paul Manafort did, whereby he represented a foreign principal without registering that representation with the U.S. Justice Department. And so the statute is written such that Hunter didn't need to change U.S. policy directly to have committed that felony. All he needed to do was advocate for that change of policy and not register with the DOJ. And we checked. You mentioned open source, or I mentioned open source intelligence. For hours, I scoured the FARA filings. I looked at all the FARA filings going back years, and not one of Hunter's associates, registered as a foreign agent. And so because of that, Matei, because in both cases he was trying to get U.S. officials to intercede with foreign officials on behalf of his foreign principal, the money that he collected from those foreign principals is subject to seizure and money laundering laws. And in fact, I reread the Paul Manafort indictment about a month ago, just to because it's in our report, but I wanted to refresh my memory. And at the end of the indictment, it goes into all of his assets that can be seized because of this foreign representation, his mansion on Long Island, his brownstone in Brooklyn. And so theoretically, all of those assets that Hunter Biden has bought with foreign cash could be seized because he didn't register that representation. And so in Ukraine, it was a insurance policy that Mykola Zlochevsky took out against prosecution, basically. And Hunter and Devin Archer, who's been convicted in the Southern District of New York, he's been sentenced, but he's appealing, were paid $83,000 a month per a piece, $83,000 to each male, to sit on this board. And Hunter had no experience in energy policy. And because we have the email correspondence on this laptop, Matei, we can see that Vadim Pizarski, the advisor to Burisma's board, and Zlochevsky were asking Hunter to use his influence within the U.S. government to advocate to drop the cases against Mykola. So our allegations are, again, very conservative and I think very tempered compared to what's been out there. We're saying that his advocacy itself is illegal because we don't have the phone call with which I believe occurred, but we don't have it as evidence, between Hunter and Joe, saying that Shokin was fired directly because of Hunter. We can infer it, but again, we don't have the evidence for it. We're saying that the FARA violation itself is illegal. Now turning to Romania, the same thing occurred. Gabriel Popoviciu hired Boy Schiller Flexner and Rosemont Seneca Consulting and Louis Freeh, the former FBI director, to intervene on his behalf with Laura Kövesi. I'm mispronouncing that name. I know you're probably laughing. Yes. Hans Klim, the U.S. ambassador to Romania, did that. We have absolute proof. They met multiple times, even at the U.S. embassy, doing that. So you have Hunter Biden, Mike Gottlieb, Louis Freeh, and Chris Boyce, the son of the founder of Boy Schiller Flexner, big-time prominent lawyer for.
Yeah, that was a dirty business, and
yes, and you mentioned Rudy was in that too, and we put that in the report. Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah. And I appreciated that. Actually, I was gonna say, Giuliani had some dirty involvement in there, and you didn't forgive him just because
Rudy
he was
Rudy has never talked about that publicly. Frustratingly, we called him to ask him for comment. Again, I called everybody in this report that we accused of a felony. We called and asked them for an alternate explanation of this material, saying, "What am I not seeing here? I'm seeing clear wire transfers based on undeclared foreign representation. How else can I read this?" And a lot of people told me to F off. A lot of people wouldn't respond. A couple of them did. I also called all of Hunter's pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers in this. And so I did the due diligence. I did ask everybody for comment beforehand. Louis Freeh told me to buzz off. And so you have this Romanian oligarch, and I did wish him a happy birthday. He just turned 63 last Thursday, Gabriel Popoviciu. But you have Gabriel.
He's in London here. I'm in London as well.
Gabriel Popoviciu.
You know what? Actually, what's happening? Can I just make a quick?
He won.
A quick summary about this case, just so people know. So this lobbying, this sort of transatlantic, high-powered lobbying against Romanian justice, actually went nowhere, and Popoviciu did end up getting sentenced, but he skipped sentencing and he went to London. He's living, a very comfortable life, a very high-end life in London, and because of how Romanian financial crime law works, even if you're sentenced, it's not for life. So it turns out that even if you don't fulfill your sentence for non-violent sort of acts, it just gets prescribed. So he's going to be a free man, I think in a few months, very shortly. And also, the lawyers that he had in London managed to convince British justice that he shouldn't be extradited because conditions in Romania are so poor, and he's such a refined individual that he couldn't take to Romanian prison. And so I think that was just a sorry case in the history of Romania. But thankfully, Kövesi, the prosecutor, back then she was the prosecutor and the chief prosecutor, and she had a lot of backbone, and she is now the head prosecutor for the whole of the European Union. So she's putting away bad people all across the European Union, across Germany, Italy, all the big countries. So clearly some good came out of this.
And it's an incredible case. It's again, in normal times, Hunter was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for that. And again, our allegation is that the representation itself is illegal, whether or not.
So FARA, can we talk a bit about FARA? So yes. It's the Foreign Lobbying Act, basically.
Yes.
So this is because sorry. So can you explain what it does and what it's for, and why it's illegal in the first place?
Yes, the law is very old. It's been on the books for 84 years. It was passed in 1938 by the U.S. Congress, and basically, the exact statutory language says if you're an agent for a foreign principal, and that foreign principal can be a business, an individual, a political party. In Manafort's case, it was a political party, the Party of Regions. If you're an agent for that foreign principal within the United States and advocate for that foreign principal to any level of government and any government official, it's not illegal. You just have to register that with the Justice Department and give very basic information. If you go to the DOJ's website, you'll see that all you have to do is give your name, your address, the name of the foreign principal, a 3-sentence description of the work, and a rough estimate of the money paid. The bar is very low. As a result, because the bar is mere disclosure and it's a very low bar, the penalties are very steep. And that's why Manafort was sent to federal prison and fined all this money. And the fines are steep, and you can go to prison for up to 10 years. And so the goal of the statute, and I went ahead and went back to 1938 and read the congressional debate on it, was basically transparency. That if you're going to be a foreign agent within the borders, we at least have to know who you're a foreign agent for and where the money's coming from. And so, Rosemont Seneca Consulting, Hunter's consulting firm, that was essentially their business model. And we have an email from Hunter's business partner, Eric Schwerin, that said they were very worried about this, about them being basically found out as FARA violators. So in response to an article, Hunter's business partner emails Hunter and says, now you know why I worry about this so much, because they were bringing up the fact that 30 years earlier, before Daley was Obama's chief of staff, he was fined for this. And so it's an incredible thing, when you find evidence of a felony. It's one thing if they just are hush-hush about it. It's another if in other emails you see them talking about them being very worried about the government enforcing the law. Sociologically, that's incredible to see somebody navigate that.
Right. Well, that's all very interesting. And there were a couple of deals with Kazakhstan in there, with Serbia. Can we talk a little bit about that? And then also the Chinese deals. The media in America has made quite a bit about China these days, about Hunter's activity with China. But let's look at Kazakhstan and Serbia first.
Very good question. At the beginning of each section of this report, we put the people involved in their picture, because unless I see their face, I can't remember them. So the people involved in the Kazakhstan deal were the sitting prime minister, who's since been arrested for treason, Karim Masimov. I haven't followed that case closely, so I don't know whether the charges are legit or trumped up. But it was Karim Masimov, Kenes Rakashev, Kengiz is what Hunter's partner calls him. There's a G in there. But And then there's an American official named Mark Holtzman who sat on the board and was the chairman of the largest commercial bank in Kazakhstan. I'm going to botch the name, so people will have to go to our report. But basically, if you start at page 165, you'll see that Hunter and his business partner Devin Archer were acting as a foreign agent for Kenneth Rakashev, even setting up calls and meetings with the sitting Secretary of State, John Kerry. And Devin Archer, Hunter's business partner, was John Kerry's vice chairman of finance on his 2004 presidential campaign. And so they were setting up meetings with American officials for Kazakhs. And again, these normal activities cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you see that in FARA filings. Secondly, more importantly, they were acting on Burisma's behalf to try to strike a deal between CONOC, the Chinese national offshore oil company. Burisma was going to drill wells in Kazakhstan and ship the natural gas to China for CONOC. And at the time, CONOC was on the U.S. sanctions list. So you have the son of the vice president, Devin Archer, who was the vice chairman and met with the sitting Secretary of State, working with a Cypriot-domiciled, Ukrainian-based natural gas company, planning to drill wells in Kazakhstan to then ship the cheap gas to China. And again, the statute violations are very simple. The working on the CONOC deal wasn't a statute violation per se, but the FARA was violated multiple times because they were back channels. In fact, with the foreign minister one time, this scenario is on page 167. Devin Archer and Hunter Biden were back channeling with Foreign Minister Idrizov to set up a call with John Kerry. This occurred on July 11th, 2013, and the then Chief of Staff for the Secretary of State, David Wade, ask Archer and Devin, hey, what does the FM want to talk about with JK? Meaning, what does Foreign Minister Idrizov want to talk about with JK? And Devin Archer says, U.S.-Kazakhstan Strategic Partnership on Nuclear Non-Proliferation, Kazakhstan WTO accession, and the New Silk Road. So you have unregistered agents talking with the sitting foreign minister of Kazakhstan on the most sensitive topics. I mean, what more sensitive can it name? A more sensitive topic than nuclear non-proliferation and WTO accession? And yet these topics were entrusted to back channelers.
Right.
And
it does sound quite serious. And, to be fair, this is, I do feel for Joe Biden a little bit on this, because I'm not really sure that it comes across like he was involved at all. It does seem to me like
we don't make that allegation, Matei.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So that's why I'm saying I'm feeling for him a little bit, because he was in a high-powered job in the most powerful country in the world, and obviously this attracts sort of people with varied interests and people of varied moral fiber, right? And so clearly Hunter Biden was a massive vulnerability for Joe Biden because of his own personality and his own vices and so forth. So in this case, it's fine to point the finger at Hunter Biden and talk about the lobbying and stuff like that. But I just want to put it out there that as a dad in a high-powered position, Joe Biden must have had a lot of nights, sleepless nights, trying to figure out what to do in this situation.
Yes,
I was being put in a very nasty position.
It is a very precarious position, but I would argue, and our report lays out the fact that Joe consistently didn't stop his son from being in situations that would exacerbate those vices. So and again, he didn't advise Hunter against any of this. You'd think that the VP would advise his son from sitting on the board of a Ukrainian energy firm at the exact time he's the point man in that country. But he didn't do so.
You don't know. It's not clear that he didn't. It's not clear that he didn't.
Said he did. He said he never discussed it with him. So that means that he didn't.
Maybe he never discussed it in a formal capacity. I don't think he never. I mean, yeah, who knows?
I'm just going off what he said. He said he never discussed his son's overseas business dealings with him. So if I'm to take him at his word, he didn't advise against any of this stuff. Because he said he never discussed it with him.
Well, that's a different thing. It's one thing to discuss the businesses themselves, and it's one thing to tell your son, look, just get the hell out of there and just stop putting me on the spot. So I doubt that he never tried to stop him, but this is just all a matter of opinion. But another thing I had to say is, first of all, I need to give another shout to H5 Strategies in Bucharest, a political and executive consultancy specialized in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and Africa. And by the way, there's total editorial independence. So the sponsor, we don't want to get them into trouble. The sponsor has no idea who is coming on the podcast, what the questions are, what the subjects of discussions are. And there's total editorial independence and separation, and we thank them for trusting us. So Hunter is actually now involved in serious tax problems in America, legal problems. He's paying back taxes and penalties because because he's being made to do it by the court. And to this point, it does look like the New York Times also tried to get a lot of his tax arrangements. So at one point or another, you were actually fighting the same fight as the New York Times, weren't you?
In the Romania case, absolutely. In fact, the reporter who urged the lawyers of the New York Times to file the complaint in the Southern District of New York, Ken Vogel, I talked to Ken Vogel, and I told him that these records that they're going to get from FOIA and the New York and the State Department has been producing them are going to be very, very revelatory, and they'll feature Gabriel Popoviciu's direct emails for all your listeners. But again, I think that the reports from the New York Times in general, not about the Romania case, but in general about this laptop, have been a day late and a dollar short, and have been sort of a limited hangout. In that, they don't talk about Joe at all, which our report goes into how Joe violated multiple federal laws and regulations. And again, I think that if we just have one device, imagine what would come up if we had FISA surveillance, which they did on the previous president. So I think that, to the degree that the New York Times will talk about statute violations, which are apparent, I applaud them. But it's not really a story about Hunter per se. It's really about a story about influence peddling. Hunter is just one of the main characters on the stage, Matei. But it's really, again, this report's really about the political class. And because there's so many people around Hunter. Here you have Devin Archer, Bevan Cooney, Mike Gottlieb. Hunter didn't get into the nitty-gritty of it. There's not evidence he put together one pitch deck. He was just making the intros. So we really try to go into all of the movers and shakers around him who effectuated this. And sometimes that included Joe. Sometimes it didn't.
Right, okay. And another thing I'd like you to talk about from the file would be Serbia, and that's because unlike the other countries that are kind of independent and kind of working their way around big geopolitical sort of currents, I think it's pretty clear that Serbia is a very close ally of Russia, and this has been happening for years, and now in the context of the Ukraine war, Serbia has been very soft on Russia. There's even now, I think, there's a lot of trading, a lot of diplomacy, a lot of very close relations anyway between the two countries, and Serbia is right in the middle of Europe. So what was Hunter actually doing in Serbia?
Well, Hunter never got involved in domestic Serbian politics. What Hunter was an unregistered agent for a very particular prominent Serbian official named Vuk Jeremic. And he, of course, was the youngest president of the UN General Assembly in world history. And the FAR violations were very simple. Hunter admits to crafting a plan with Vuk Jeremic to basically run for the general secretary position, and Vuk Jeremic got third in the voting. But you'll see in emails in April of 2015, he's saying that he needs to talk in person about this plan he's hatched for Vuk Jeremic, and he also invites Vuk to a private dinner at Cafe Milano restaurant in DC with Joe. So Hunter is basically parting the waters for Vuk Jeremic in the United States political sphere, and trying to get him in front of Joe himself, and just a private dinner, not like a public event. And then you also, I guess, the only involvement, non-illegal but worthy, I guess, noteworthy involvement is Hunter's firm funded Vuk Jeremich's think tank, CIRSD, the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, excuse me. That think tank in Belgrade, the board of advisors of that is basically locked with high-level Chinese officials. Ye Jinming, the chairman of CEFC, was on that advisory board, and Vuk Jeremich refers to the now disappeared Ye Jinming as one of his good friends. Basically, he was one of the people who introduced Hunter Biden to CEFC, and that's a good segue, I think, to the Chinese section. Is Vuk acted as this bridge between the East and the West. He knew all these officials from his UN days, and Jeremich was perfectly happy to act as that basically convening point for the Chinese and the Westerners.
Right. Okay. Well, that's an interesting thing between China and Serbia, and so there was no connection directly with Russia at all. It's just the fact that Serbia happens to be close to Russia.
We couldn't find any. We looked deeply into the laptop. There is plenty of evidence that Hunter corresponded with Russian officials and sought investments, and so the interactions with Russian nationals, to our knowledge, didn't reach the level of felony. We found no evidence that Hunter advocated U.S. government officials on behalf of Russian nationals. We can just find business transactions.
And so I suppose that brings us to the Baltics. There was a very interesting section of the report where Baltic banks are mentioned, especially a couple of them that were extremely controversial, and especially one which was ABLV Bank, which is now closed for one of the biggest money laundering scandals in the history of Europe, including wiring money illegally in violation of sanctions against North Korea, and all sorts of money laundering linked to Russian oligarchs and influence operations, and what have you. The whole menu of dirty business in Eastern Europe. This bank was right at the heart of it. So what was Hunter Biden doing getting money from that bank?
Very particularly, Hunter's business partner and him had a shell company called Rosemont Seneca Bohai LLC, which was the focus of the Indian bond fraud case, which implicated Devon Archer. As a part of that litigation, bank statements were released by the government for this shell company called Rosemont Seneca Bohai LLC. We scoured through those bank statements and literally digitized all of them, over 300 pages. On April 22nd, 2014, that shell company received a $142,300 wire transfer from Novartis Holding Pte. Limited, which was a Singaporean domiciled shell company beneficially owned by Kenes Rakashev. And the reason why ABLV came up is because Kenes Rakashev's shell company used that Latvian bank. It literally says ABLV Bank AS Riga, Latvia, to make that transaction. The day after, in basically perfect money laundering form, that same amount went to a Schneider Nelson Motor Company to buy a new Porsche SUV for Hunter. And this, again, based on reporting from the New York Post, is directly involved in the grand jury investigation involving Hunter Biden right now. So in 6 months, if he does get indicted, we can go back to this talk and see 169 in our dossier and say this was the subject of a grand jury investigation. And because we have access to Hunter's tax numbers, not the actual returns, but from his assistant, what he made, we know that he didn't classify this as income, which he should have, because he then bought the car. So that's a clear New York State money laundering violation, which they just got Steve Bannon on, which they indicted Steve Bannon for, and federal money laundering. So ABLV Bank, just to be very quick and succinct, ABLV Bank was used by the president's son to illegally tax evasion, purchase a Porsche SUV from a Singaporean domiciled shell company run by Kenneth Rakashev.
Right, and I would also like to make the point here that ABLV was world famous because you've got a Kazakh businessman who can open bank accounts anywhere he likes, but he chooses this little obscure bank in Latvia. Why? Because the bank was world famous for not checking the source of funds. So anyone with money, be it corrupt officials, and I'm not saying Rakishev did anything wrong. I'm just saying Rakishev picked one of the worst banks in the world to wire money to Hunter Biden. So about Ukraine now, back to Ukraine, and this is the final question because we're running out of time as well. The Ukraine stuff has been aired quite widely in the media. Is there anything new in the final version of the report? Not necessarily just about Ukraine, but about any Eastern European countries that you think adds anything to the news?
Well, what our report does is systematically lay out all of the illegal interactions that Hunter had, right? So Hunter getting on the board of this company isn't by itself illegal. The only thing we include in this report is Hunter reaching out to U.S. government officials. So we have him reaching out to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, the U.S. State Department, trying to strong-arm the U.S. State Department to then strong-arm the Mexican government to let Mykola Zlochevsky into their country because there was a flag on his file being a minister for Yanukovych. And so, everything that has been said about Ukraine, I think, has lacked specificity. And so we go into Ihor Kolomoisky and how all the wire funds that were sent to Devon and Hunter were sent from Privat Bank, which again is the subject of four different lawsuits within the United States for defrauding depositors.
Right, and Kolomoisky is under U.S. sanctions now, isn't he?
Yes.
And his bank was closed. I actually interviewed in the previous podcast. I interviewed the central banker of Ukraine who closed down Privat Bank in Ukraine for extensive fraud.
I'm going to have to go watch that. I'm going to have to listen to that.
Yeah,
because Joe Biden directly talked about that with Poroshenko on November 16th. 2016, he urges Poroshenko to nationalize Privat ASAP. And I think that's very interesting considering his son was getting wire transfers through that bank from this
is again to Joe Biden's credit because nationalizing Privat Bank was probably the best thing that happened to Ukraine because that bank was destroying the Ukrainian economy. And I
definitely think it saved some depositors, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a fraud of $5.5 billion, I think, that was proven. It's probably higher than that, but the Ukrainians had to borrow money from the IMF, and if they hadn't nationalized that particular bank, the Ukrainian economy would have collapsed, and probably today with the war, the Ukrainians wouldn't have been able to resist invasion so well as they have. So now back to the point of the bank. What exactly was Hunter doing with Privat Bank before nationalization?
All of the funds over the $2.5 million that was sent to his shell company over the course of 2014 to 2019, he served a 5-year term, that was sent through Privat Bank. And so we would argue that it facilitated and helped Hunter's board position because Ukrainian journalists have tried to pierce the corporate veil and see what involvement Kolomoisky has had with Brasidi Investments Limited, which is the holding company that owns Burisma. And so they actually call Mykola Zlochevsky a mini-garg and Kolomoisky the oligarch. And so our report raises questions on a $12.3 million wire transfer that came in to the holding company that owns Burisma in May of 2014. And the reason why we have records of that is because the prosecutor general's office released them in Ukraine. So we have that $12.3 million wire transfer. And our question, and we don't make an allegation, our question is whether or not those funds came from Kolomoisky or one of his minions in Privat Bank. to Zlochevsky because Zlochevsky already used them for Burisma. Like a lot of the accounts for Burisma were held at Pravat Bank.
Right. Well, that is what a story, what a web, what a fantastic sort of fascinating.
Sociologically,
thing.
it doesn't get better than this.
Yeah. Do you think there's going to be a Netflix show about this one? Once the dust actually settles in a few years.
I think that nothing will happen to Hunter at the federal level. So I don't think there'll be a Netflix show. I think that a Netflix show will only occur if a state level official looks at this evidence and tries to try him at a state level. That's my answer.
Well, you never know with American justice because there was a lot of speculation that SBF Sam Bankman-Fried wouldn't get indicted because he donated all this money to politicians. But what happened? The Southern District of New York made a case against him, and now he's moving. He's being indicted in America and he's being extradited. So we'll just have to see. And of course, until the man gets convicted, he's innocent until proven guilty. So we should state that so far he hasn't been convicted of anything. So he's a free man, and rightly so. And so with that, Garrett, I appreciate your time. Thanks very much. Merry Christmas to you and the family.
Merry Christmas.
One last shout out to H5 Strategies in Bucharest, political and executive consultancy for Eastern Europe, Africa, and Central Asia. And good luck in the future. Good luck going after the Mexican cartels. And who knows, maybe in a little while you'll join us again on Reportercast.
Thank you very much.